Well, the layoffs at Bungie are happening once again, but this time it's different. This report just hit yesterday, and everyone is weighing in on what it means. Former employees are taking aim at the leadership and the CEO of Bungie. Others are calling this a Sony takeover. And many are confused given the strong reception to the Final Shape DLC, as it was supposed to be the deciding factor if more layoffs would happen or not. Now, in my previous coverage of the Bungie layoffs, I predicted that two things may happen in the future. First, that more layoffs would happen. The overall impression that I had of the company morale and the statements from current and past employees simply did not paint a strong picture. And even though the Final Shape may have done well critically and commercially, the current and future content rhythm of Destiny 2 seems to signal that the game is headed toward end of life. This would mean that they need to lower production cost, as revenue will likely slow down for the game as they shift to other projects, and many assume future plans for Destiny 3. Now, the second thing I said might happen is a Sony takeover. It was clear, based on all previous reporting, that many current and former Bungie employees thought there was a real possibility of Bungie losing some of their independence, especially with respect to leadership and the board. And given the nature of these layoffs and the announcement, it seems that the Sony takeover has begun. We also have industry insiders speaking to who is actually in charge at Bungie right now, leading to some speculating that Pete Parsons will step down, while some former employees are outright calling for him to leave. Now, every weekday here on Reforge Gaming, I tell you what I think about a gaming topic, and then we go to a live stream where I want to hear what you think. So, if you like this content and you want more like it, hit like and subscribe. So what exactly happened? Well, Pete Parsons, the current CEO of Bungie, tweeted and published a blog on August 31st of 2024, and the blog was titled "The New Path for Bungie," which I kind of have to say that's not the greatest title when you're announcing layoffs. I get that you have to focus on the future and you have far more current employees to think about, but it might have been better optically to just sort of announce layoffs and these employee integration plans as something like, hey, this is a necessary change for Bungie, or difficult but needed changes for Bungie, because the new path for Bungie sounds sort of like that person who won't stop talking about their exciting upcoming trip in front of people who are not being included. However, I will admit that the title makes more sense as you read the announcement, because this is not a simple layoff press release. He does, however, rip off the band-aid rather quickly and rather bluntly. He says, quote, "That means beginning today, 220 of our roles will be eliminated, representing roughly 17% of our studio's workforce." Now, keep in mind, this is just the percentage who are being laid off. More employees are leaving Bungie, but not in the way that you might think. Again, this is a very different announcement than just layoffs, and our first clue about it being different is how some of the employees will be integrated into Sony. Parsons said the following: "First, we are deepening our integration with Sony Interactive Entertainment, working to integrate 155 of our roles, roughly 12%, into SIE over the next few quarters. SIE has worked tirelessly with us to identify roles for as many of our people as possible, enabling us together to save a great deal of talent that would otherwise have been affected by the reduction in force." Now, two things to notice here. First, this is not happening immediately. So while this is good news, this is something that will take time, as they indicate that roughly 12% of Bungie will integrate into these roles over the next few quarters. The second thing to notice is that SIE was active in this, meaning they are likely targeting and wanting to retain talent. Potentially, this is related to the Live Center Service of Excellence that PlayStation wants to continue to establish. There is the remote possibility, however, that a portion of these people will not get integrated and end up being laid off anyway, but according to sources I spoke to, these 155 people do have positions at SIE. It's just going to take time to integrate them. So I don't think this is like a maybe situation. However, we'll have to wait and see. Now, the second part of the announcement was that a new studio is being spun up. Quote, "Second, we are working with PlayStation Studios leadership to spin out one of our incubation projects, an action game set in a brand new science fantasy universe, to form a new studio within PlayStation Studios to continue its promising development." Now, at first I thought this might be Marathon, but they're describing it as an action game in a brand new science science fantasy universe. That doesn't really sound like Marathon. And the blog post did not say how many employees would be included in this plan, but Bloomberg's Jason Schreier claimed in a tweet it's approximately 75 people. He also claimed that this takes the grand total of the employees at Bungie from 1,300 to 850. And while this means that Bungie is still one of the larger studios in the world, it is a significant reduction given they already laid off 100 people last year. Now you might be asking, what led to all of this? Well, fear not. Pete Parsons spent the second half of the blog explaining how this happened. Many people are rightly questioning how this could happen after, well, the final shape apparently did. High critical and consumer reception, high player numbers, which I think in turn it's fair to assume that means that the DLC saw commercial success as well. But Parsons gets pretty transparent about the ambitions at Bungie and how they exceeded what was sustainable. And the first problem was lots of incubation projects from the blog. For over 5 years, it has been our goal to ship games in 3 enduring global franchises. To realize that ambition, we set up several incubation projects, each seeded with senior development leaders from our existing teams. We eventually realized that this model stretched our talent too thin too quickly. It also forced our studio support structures to scale to a larger level than we could realistically support, given our 2 primary products in development, Destiny and Marathon. So to summarize, they got more ambitious than they could conceivably support. And last year, when they missed revenue targets by a large percentage, that was likely a huge cause for this, which is why, at the time, many employees felt that more layoffs were on the way. And he admits that in the next paragraph. He concludes that, quote, "We were overly ambitious, our financial safety margins were subsequently exceeded, and we began running in the red." He even goes on in the very next paragraph to say that they did everything they could to avoid this outcome. Well, everything except for take pay cuts, because it was previously reported that the idea of leadership taking pay cuts was rejected because, quote, "Bungie is not that type of company." So, this all leads to the million-dollar question. Is this a Sony takeover? The most natural question when layoffs like this happen is why, or what does this mean for the future? Fans of the franchise, the laid off employees, even current employees are left wondering what the future holds. Well, a Sony-controlled future looks to be already in play. When industry insider Jeff Grubb was asked about this, his response does not sound speculative, and if his sources are correct, we should see evidence relatively quickly. Someone asked him on Twitter if he had heard anything, and his first and very succinct reply was, "Herman Hulst runs Bungie now," which that obviously got a lot of attention. I, for one, support this. I hope that this is true. I have maintained for roughly 4 years that leadership at Bungie needs to go. But Grubb wasn't finished. He went on to say this. Also, they attempted to soften the blow by sending many people from Bungie into SIE instead of just cutting them. I thought the number of jobs lost was going to be closer to 350. Now, this is obviously one of the silver linings of the layoffs, that SIE worked with Bungie to retain roughly 150 people. But Jeff Grubb also went on to say the following. I'll put it as far as I know, which isn't everything by a long shot. In time, Bungie will lose its autonomy and will become like any other PlayStation Worldwide studio under SIE and Herman Hulst. And then he clarified, he said, and by in time, I mean that this is a process that is starting now, but it is happening. So even though he's admitting his knowledge is limited, he seems to think rather strongly that the Sony takeover has started. As he said, listen, it is happening. And I'll be honest, setting aside personal feelings about Bungie as a company and the culture there, I think there is both good and bad with a Sony takeover. Now, the good is that first, as I already stated, the leadership needs to go. Both current and former employees have not been shy about their opinions on this. The decision has been called inexcusable, along with calls for accountability. And as I said earlier in this video, numerous employees have pointed the finger directly at Pete Parsons. Now, back in December of 2021, almost 3 years ago, when I covered the toxic culture at Bungie that was exposed by IGN, I largely concluded that the article was a puff piece. I felt that they knew this stuff was going to come out and they wanted to get in front of it, and they had IGN write a very, very friendly piece about it, celebrating Bungie as a hero, when the reality reality was they were covering up wrongdoing, they paid victims to be quiet, and the retaliation culture was still well in place. I was also quick to point out that Pete Parsons went to that interview and he tried to shield the company with stats about diversity and other red herrings. At the time, a former employee reached out to me and said that they appreciated my coverage, and they confirmed that the retaliation culture was still well in place at Bungie, and it basically came from the top. They were not shy about indicating how they felt that it all stemmed from Pete Parsons. So now, roughly 3 years later, with both current and former employees loudly calling for leadership to be held accountable, I have to think that Pete Parsons may no longer be in his position much longer. In fact, the boldness of how people are talking about this, the statements that they are making, could mean that they know it's coming, or maybe they just sense it's a very likely outcome. Either way, it would be a good thing to come out of a Sony takeover. It's also just good for the company in general to lower production costs if they are entering into a stage of developing their next game and they're putting Destiny 2 onto cruise control. Now, the bad thing about a Sony takeover is that they will likely find redundancies and lay people off. It could also lead to projects being canceled. But at some level, Sony has every right to step in at this point. Per the terms of their deal, and reported here by PC Gamer, Sony spent $1.2 billion to retain key Bungie talent as part of the acquisition deal. And in the article that reported on this, they said the following: roughly 1/3 of the buyout price, $1.2 billion, is allocated to employee retention in the form of deferred payments to employee shareholders, conditional upon their continued employment, and other retention incentives. That money will be paid out over the course of several years after the acquisition closes. So, from the very beginning, Sony went to this rather expensive length to keep employees. And even now, they continue to do so by finding roles within SIE to integrate folks into those positions. So blaming the layoffs on the acquisition isn't just disingenuous, it is factually inaccurate. Bungie is going through this, according to their own CEO, because they got too ambitious and they could not afford how far they had stretched themselves. And it was reported by Forbes at the time of the layoffs last year that, quote, some employees were told that if the Sony buyout did not happen, that with the current Destiny 2 performance, the studio itself would have been in jeopardy if they were still independent. So there was other talk at the exact same time about this, that they were greatly concerned not just that more layoffs would happen, but there was concern that they were just trying to ship Marathon out the door and that people would leave around 2026 when those incentives were no longer being paid out. So the question is, as we've all thought, what do I think about this? Well, listen, there's far too many comments, there's far too many insiders, there's former employees, there's current employees, okay? It's all aligning on one thing. Leadership needs to go, and Sony seems to be taking over. I just can't see it any other way. And while there is no way to know if it's going to end up putting the franchises like Destiny or Marathon into better places, or if some of the projects currently in incubation will actually come to market, it certainly couldn't get any worse under the current leadership. But those are just my thoughts, and now it's time to hear your thoughts. And you can do that in a comment below, or you can come to the live stream that follows this video. We put a link in a pinned comment below, as well as it'll hit a card right here. And if you like this content and you want more like it, please remember to like, share, and subscribe.